In the response to aggression inquiry, so we're kind of lumping together the world wars, and we've discussed some aspects related to this, whether it has to do with rationing, kind of the volunteerism, that sort of thing. You can see right here kind of the objectives for this particular section that has to do with why we enter World War One, Wilson's plan for peace. How we get into the Second World War, the fighting in Europe, as well as the Pacific area, kind of the home front, and then, of course, responses to Soviet aggression. So we have kind of this big, broad concept. And rather than, and this particular inquiry is a little bit different in the sense that I did not curate a bunch of videos for you. Mostly because there's so much out there, like it's impossible and nothing is short. And really, the textbook, The American Yawp, has a couple of really good chapters, both on World War I and World War II, that give you a really solid overview. I share down here, and you do not have to feel like you don't have to feel like you need to watch these. But the Century America's Time has some really, really good, fairly short. They're about 45 minutes apiece. Talking about these particular conflicts. And one of the reasons this is actually kind of an older series that originally came out on video cassette. But I like it because it tends to work well with the standards for the state of Texas. Not entirely, it's not perfect, but it's pretty darn close, actually, for something that is not entirely created by the TEA and that kind of thing. So I shared those there. That's a great way if you feel like you need a little more information, or if you're just interested. This will give you some background information. But I'm going to try to give you kind of an overview in really kind of a quick way, with a focus on the questions that we have here. Why does the U.S. enter the fighting? How does it help the U.S. become a world power? Why is it considered total war? And then how does the U.S. and the Soviet Union begin to have these tense relationships, right? So that's going to be kind of the focus that I'm looking at. So to start with World War One, and you can if you go to Google Drive or go to course materials, rather, it'll take you to this particular folder. And I have everything kind of listed there. Oh, sorry, my oven's going off. I have everything listed there. So you can always pull that up and see what's, look at the PowerPoints, that kind of thing, and kind of give you an idea for what that looks like. Sorry. Trying to do too many things at once here. Anyways, so, just kind of a heads up that's an available resource for you. And I'm not going to touch on every single aspect of World War One, just simply because you can kind of look through this yourself. You do have this idea of colonialism. One of the reasons why historians tend to call the period from the Napoleonic Wars to World War One as the long century of peace, is because really it's not all that peaceful. If you're a country that's being colonized, Africa, Asia, for instance, it's not peaceful. It is peaceful in Europe, though. And of course, the U.S. has been participating in that with our own type of imperialism. And we've danced around kind of the progressive presidents with Roosevelt and Taft and Wilson. And what's unique about these progressive presidents is that, they're very much about kind of reforming and changing things in the American system. All of them have a kind of difficult relationship with U.S. involvement. Now, Teddy Roosevelt's probably the most likely to want to engage in that. He's the big guy behind the Rough Riders. He believes in the Panama Canal. But Taft and Wilson in particular were a little less inclined to get involved. Really felt like maybe that wasn't the best kind of foreign policy approach. And so Wilson in particular tries very hard to kind of get the U.S. out of global engagement, except it doesn't work, right? Because Taft with dollar diplomacy, we've got all these investments, and you end up having Wilson sending troops in a whole lot. Now, I would argue that part of this is because Wilson is kind of self-righteous and thinks he knows everything. And so, when there's a crisis, his response is, well, let's go in and tell them how to do things. Remember, this is one of the kind of the ugly sides of progressivism is progressives like to boss people around, right? They like to tell people how they should live, how they should talk, how they should communicate. And so this is just a kind of a classic problem that you see. And it's important to note that Wilson, that we do send troops into Mexico, because part of how we get involved in World War I is connected with this whole deal with Mexico. And of course, you've had in Europe an alliance system. This all goes back to the Franco-Prussian War. There's a whole, like if we were world history, we would go into all the drama that kind of leads us up to that. But for our purposes, just know that that Germany and Austria-Hungary were kind of an alliance, that Russia and France were an alliance. And so you have lots of kind of situations where you kind of have, these best friends, these kind of lunchroom mentality that, this is my clique and you can't mess with my clique, right? You also have the rise of militarism. This goes back to Mahan's naval theory, the idea that strong navies mean strong countries. And so you have pretty much every major country in the world engaging in serious military buildup. You start to have more nationalism, a sense of being proud of your country, kind of having a strong national identity. We're the best, no one can beat us. And then, of course, you have the assassination of the Archduke Franz Ferdinand. And there's a whole backstory to that with Austria-Hungary trying to control Serbia and Serbia wanting to be independent. And it's part of this nationalism idea that these smaller countries that ethnically and language-wise and religion-wise weren't as connected with the bigger empires they were a part of. And so this is what you see, this nationalism is going to come out of that. And so you end up with this two-front war happening. And of course, the trench ends right before Paris. And so you can see the Central Powers, Germany, Austria-Hungary. Italy's kind of neutral. They're sort of siding, but they're not really helping Germany and Austria-Hungary. And Italy will flip sides eventually. The Ottoman Empire becomes a part of the Central Powers. And so just kind of know that central area right here, this is one group, then you've got Russia and France and the UK. And a lot of what's going to happen is because the Germans go through Belgium to invade France, and the United Kingdom is like, oh no, you can't pick on little Belgium, And so you have this kind of really difficult kind of trench warfare, this Western Front, just miserable fighting conditions. Now, the U.S. will try to claim neutrality, except of course we've invested a ton of money. We're selling goods. So we're not nearly as neutral as we would like to think. This is the frustration with that's going to cause Germany to attack some of our ships. So you've got the Lusitania in 1915, the Sussex in 1916. And by 1917, Germany has basically decided, you know what, forget it. We're going to risk U.S. involvement. And of course, part of what they do is then they reach out to Mexico. They try to form an alliance with them and say, hey, we're going to start unrestricted submarine warfare. And if you'll take our side, then when we win, we'll give you back Texas, New Mexico, and Arizona. And of course, when this gets released, when the British intelligence finds this memo, they release it to the United States. This on top of resumed unrestricted submarine warfare. These things push the United States into declaring war. And, for Germany, this is very much a part of kind of that European mindset. That doesn't make it okay, but it does kind of help explain why they would think that was a good approach. And so, Wilson will give his declaration of war address. And of course, the supreme irony is, that we're going to fight for democracy, for people who submit to authority to have a voice in their own governments. When women can't vote, when African Americans are being oppressed, So there's lots of irony with Wilson. Wilson's, like I said, he's a complicated character, to say the least. So that's how the U.S. gets involved, right? We try to maintain neutrality. We get kind of sucked into the conflict. And you have this notion of the total war. You have the Selective Service Act. You have a draft that takes place. Women serve in an auxiliary corps. They're not actually in a formal part of the military during this period, but they are kind of on the side. You have lots of propaganda. The Committee on Public Information. We have control. We've talked about this before. Control of transportation. Encouraging people on food consumption, Liberty bonds, that kind of thing. And really, under Wilson, the economy is going to end up looking a whole lot like a very tightly controlled economy. Now, I mentioned before that part of the problem is that then they when the war's over, they say, "Oh, hey, we don't have to do this anymore. We don't have to, have these requirements on wages and hours and all this kind of stuff." And so this is all going to help lead to why you'll have that shock, that kind of Red Scare that happens right after World War I is over. And of course, women working, volunteering, that's going to help strengthen the argument for the 19th Amendment. The demand for jobs that begin really as early as like 1912, 1913 with kind of the militarism that was taking hold. African Americans move up north. Mexican and Mexican Americans, that their population increases in the country, in part because Mexico has been going through a civil war, and there's all these job opportunities. And so that's going to make a huge difference to kind of attracting people. Now, this doesn't mean that everything's hunky-dory and it's a period of civil rights, because it's not. But you do have this economic opportunity that emerges. Some of the big things, and we'll touch on this a little bit more when we talk about kind of civil rights. But not only do you have this idea of the Committee on Public Information and propaganda, but you also have these loyalty leagues where basically neighbors are spying on neighbors. German Americans in particular get targeted. We even have an Espionage Act and a Sedition Act. World War I was not as popular. There were groups of people, particularly labor unions, that had been fighting from the Gilded Age to the Progressive Era. They really see this as a battle of corporations, and they resent the fact that this war has taken place. And so they're pushing back. They're complaining. They're saying you shouldn't have to sign up for the draft. And so we have the Espionage and Sedition Acts that get pushed through that are meant to stop any kind of criticism. So, and one of the great Supreme Court cases are going to say that, hey, during a time of war, the government can do extraordinary things like limit free speech. And so socialists and unions in particular are going to get targeted. This kind of dovetails with this idea of the Red Scare. So kind of put that within that context. And of course, you're going to have this Red Scare that takes place once the war's over, kind of this reaction. Some of this, too, has to do with the Bolshevik Revolution and what becomes the Soviet Union. So there's a lot of different things kind of happening. So we've already touched on that a little bit. Technology, you've had lots of artillery, grenades, machine guns, airplanes, early tanks, lots of different ways that technology is used during the conflict. The U.S. forces, the American Expeditionary Force, the AEF, that's what they're called during World War I, led by General John Pershing. Sergeant Alvin York is, of course, another one of those. And he wins the Medal of Honor. American troops were largely held back until 1918. There's a little bit of fighting at the end of 1917, in part because Pershing is not going to let the British use our guys for cannon fodder, so to speak. And so when we do let the soldiers come in, they will tip the stalemate, right? They have fresh troops, fresh equipment. And of course, you also have in the midst of this, how very timely, the Spanish flu, a global pandemic. So very similar to you might have seen some things about that lately with the coronavirus. The Spanish flu is kind of the 1918 version of that. Now, the Spanish flu particularly affected young people, 20 to 34, and people they would be fine one day and then they would be dead the next. So would hit in some ways faster than the coronavirus does, but has that kind of spread and is particularly deadly. Now, if they'd had modern medicine, it wouldn't have been as deadly. But this is kind of, part of what's going to help contribute to the end of the war. And so World War I is going to end in part because Woodrow Wilson, by January of 1918, he starts talking about his 14 points. He's got this idea of peace without victory, that you're going to have free trade, disarmament, freedom of the seas. We're going to adjust colonies. We're going to have this League of Nations to settle territorial disputes. Lots of emphasis on this idea that we don't have to lord it over the people that we defeat, right? And they make a big push about sharing out this 14 points. Well, the Germans, when they see this, right, of course, they're by 1918, the American troops are having a huge impact. The Spanish flu is having a big impact. And so the Germans will they will reach an armistice on the 11th hour of the 11th day of the 11th month. In order to, hoping that the 14 points will kind of be this plan for peace. Now, that's not how it plays out. The Treaty of Versailles, of course, will have a big role to play in that. The Treaty of Versailles, you have Britain, France, Italy, and the U.S. Germany's not allowed to show up. They're not allowed to have any kind of say. They get this really strict peace agreement where they lose territory and colonies. They're forced to demilitarize, the war guilt, the massive reparations. So lots of issues with the Treaty of Versailles that really does not resemble the 14 points at all, with the exception of the League of Nations. And of course, then the U.S. will basically refuse to sign the Treaty of Versailles. So the main power, the main country that was supposed to be behind that, does not agree to it. So the Treaty of Versailles is really kind of a huge failure. Really impacts Germany, sets the stage for Hitler to come to power. The U.S. will reject the Treaty of Versailles because we don't want to get sucked into another conflict. This idea that we don't want to go to war. We don't want to be this kind of Washington's farewell address. We don't want to be involved in other countries' issues. And the Senate rejects that. And so you basically have kind of this attitude that we're not going to embrace this treaty. Wilson will have a stroke for the last year of his presidency, so the treaty will not pass. And really that's going to leave the League of Nations basically kind of weak and toothless, as you can see from these political cartoons here. Ultimately, the global context of World War I changes Europe. Breaks apart the Austria-Hungary Empire, the Turkish Empire, and to the Russian Empire. The Middle East, the way it's mandated, often is kind of seen as the foundation for the problems that we have now in the Middle East. Lots of economic challenges. Germany's humiliated. You also start to have some independence movements. The Ho Chi Minh, who becomes the head of the North Vietnamese, is shaped by World War I, right? And you also have the Panama Canal. So one of the reasons why the U.S. was such a big trading partner is going to have to do with the fact that that the Panama Canal made trade much easier. So kind of that impact there. So that gives you kind of a quick overview. I may kind of add another kind of curate a couple videos regarding Mahan's naval theory, a couple things like that. But for the most part, that should kind of help give you this big idea. The reading and the American Yawp should help you as well. And so that's it for World War I.